So we've been in Hebrews 11. I actually want you guys to turn in your Bibles to Judges chapter 4. And I'll start. I'm going to just actually read off my phone. But Hebrews 11 is kind of where we've been camping for the last many weeks. Give us what do you guys remember? Who have we covered in Hebrews 11 so far? Give me a name. Noah. What did we talk about with Noah? Faith. Nice. Yeah. Yeah.
Faith with action.
Faith with action, right? Yeah, that was super cool. And we talked about the fact that sometimes when we obey, even when we don't see what we're in the moment, it's so worth it to watch how God works that out. Noah's a great example of that. Who else have we talked about? No, I don't think Jonah. Oh, we did talk about Jonah, but it was Seth's lesson. What did Seth talk about? I heard it. Minor prophets, yeah. So there's a little saying in Hebrews 11 that says, and the prophets. So Seth kind of took some liberty with that, but he did a good job. Yeah, we see the faith of the minor prophets. Who else? Gideon. What do you remember about Gideon?
Again,
Taylor, go ahead.
He trusted the Lord to do things that
Yeah. Yeah, big time. And anybody remember who Gideon was? He was a judge, right? We're going to be talking about judges tonight. So Gideon is one of those guys that we will probably visit briefly. Who else? Rahab, yeah. Yeah, Rahab who hid the spies. You remember that? Sobs was on a guy that's kind of not very well known, but has a super Enoch, right? What's the cool thing about Enoch? He walked with God. They never said that he died, right? There's some debate on it, but I think that Enoch is going to be one of the guys coming back in Revelation to judge in the millennial, or in the. Thank you. Yeah, 7 years. Thanks, Seth. It's been a long day. Yeah, and then we already talked about Gideon. So we've talked about a number of these different people, right? And the whole thing that we're looking at is because we are in Cain and Abel. That's the other one I was thinking of. But we're seeing over and over again that because of what God has done through the cross, this new covenant that has been ushered in, which we respond to and are changed by because of our faith. Faith has always been the mode by which God has worked, right? We see that coming up next week is Abraham, I think. Yeah, because you're doing Moses. So next week is Abraham. We see Abraham was the first person to be said that because of his faith, he was credited righteousness, right? God has never changed his mode of how people come into relationship and are changed, both spiritually here and now, but also spiritually for eternity. God has never changed his mode, but we see in Hebrews 11, this is just a huge part of how God works. I want to just read for you guys. This is kind of toward the end of Hebrews 11. I'm going to go through a number of different things. Starting in verse 32, it says this. What more shall I say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, were made strong out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. Women received back their dead by resurrection. Some were tortured, refusing to accept release so that they might rise again to a better life. Others suffered mocking and flogging and even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, they were killed with the sword. They went in and out of skins of sheep and goats, destitute, afflicted, and mistreated, of whom the world was not worthy, wandering about in the deserts and mountains and in the dens and in the caves of the earth. And it goes on and it talks about how all of these different people by faith, we see a couple of people that are just mentioned by name, and then we have this whole list of people that it's a description of something that someone did, and sometimes those can be applied to multiple people. It talks about wandering in the desert, right? I think of John the Baptist. It talks about being flogged and beaten and persecuted. I think of the Apostle Peter and the Apostle Paul. All of these different people have been changed, both here and now, but also for eternity in heaven because of their faith. It is by our faith that we respond. And so tonight I want to look at a story. It's mentioned, one of the guys that is mentioned in Hebrews 11 is Barak. And I put this in parentheses because Barak actually wasn't even a judge. He's just in the book of Judges as a person. But a powerful story. So I need 5 readers tonight. Those are our 5 passages. So Diddy, I want you to read 1 through 3. Taylor, 4 through 10. Dylan, 11 through 16. Jackie, 17 through 24. Jason, you can read 1 and 2. Okay? So we're gonna take these a chunk at a time, but I want to look at some aspects of what we see in the story about how Barak, who's just mentioned briefly by name, shows us something really important about faith. Okay? So whoever I said 1 through 3.
The people of Israel again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord after Ehud died. And the Lord sold them into the land of Jabin, king of Canaan, who reigned in Hazor. The commander of his army was Sisera, who lived in Harosheth Haggim. Then the people of Israel cried out to the Lord for help, and he had 900 chariots of iron and oppressed the people of Israel cruelly for 20 years.
Awesome. So we're introduced to something that we see over and over and over again in the book of Judges. This is actually called the cycle of Judges. We've talked about this in Sunday school in the past, but I want to just give you a little visual help to understand what the cycle of the Judges was. Okay, over and over again, we see this thing come up in chapter 4, verse 1. The people of Israel again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. Okay, here's the cycle. Israel sins. They chase their own sin. They worship false idols. They disobey God's law. And after so long, God gives them over to the people in the land that eventually they are, and even right now, they're supposed to be wiping out. But because they disobeyed, even in that sense, they don't follow through what God tells them to do. They are given over as captives to those people. Okay, so for a time they'll be enslaved, they'll be persecuted, and it's terrible. And finally, Israel will cry out to God, not the idols they're worshiping, but to the one true Yahweh God. God raises up a judge. Do we know what a judge is? Okay, we're not talking about a guy with a robe and a gavel. A judge in Israel was somebody raised up by God, both to deliver messages like prophets, but also to act supernaturally on behalf of God and on behalf of Israel. So, who are some judges? We already talked about Gideon, right? Gideon was a judge who led an army of 300 into a battle and totally obliterated everybody by not even doing anything, right? They lit some candles, they broke some stuff, and they were blowing trumpets, and then all the army just totally slaughtered themselves. That's God, but through the leadership of Gideon. Another judge, we see Samson, right? Samson's a well-known judge. Samson's like the guy that tied some foxes together, lit them on fire, totally destroyed everybody's crop. He killed all those dudes with the jawbone of a donkey. You remember these stories? Samson was a judge who, at the end of his life, pushed these pillars apart and killed everybody who was there to watch him be put to death. God uses these judges to deliver Israel, and then for a time they will serve God, and then the cycle starts over. So in chapter 4, we're told that they were doing what was evil in the sight of the Lord after Ehud died. Okay, so Ehud was a judge. You guys remember Ehud? One of my favorite stories, right? He stabbed the fat king. The dagger got engulfed. If you don't, read Judges chapter 3, starting in verse 12. That's a good story for bedtime, all right? But we have these details because Israel is sinning, and finally they cry out to God after this captive period in time. They cry out to God. God raises up somebody to set them free. Okay, who do they send? Look at verses 4 through 10.
Now Deborah, a prophet, the wife of Lapidoth, was leading Israel at the time. She held court under the palm of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim. The Israelites went up to her to have their disputes decided. She sent Barak, son of Abinoam, from Kadesh in Naphtali, and said to him, "The Lord, the God of Israel, commands you, go, take with you 10,000 men of Naphtali and Zebulun, and lead them up to Mount Tabor. I will lead Sisera, the commander of Jabin's army, with his chariots and his troops to the Kishon River, and give them into your hands." Barak said to her, "If you go with me, I will go, but if you don't go with me, I won't go." Certainly I will go with you, said Deborah, but because of the course you are taking, the honor will not be yours, for the Lord will deliver Sisera into the hands of the Lord. So Deborah went with Barak to Kadesh. There Barak summoned Zebulun and Naphtali, and 10,000 men went under his command. Deborah also went with him.
Awesome. So in chapter 4, verses 4 through 10, we see that the judge who was ruling at this time was actually Deborah. Okay, Deborah was a prophetess who was judging Israel at the time that Jabin and his army were controlling this area of Israel, specifically Zebulun and Naphtali. And so we're talking like right here is where the main portion is. Okay, so hopefully this map will be helpful if you want to kind of get an idea. This stretches a long territory of Israel, so this account that we're taking has a lot in it. But we're introduced to Barak in this passage as somebody who Deborah, the judge, comes to and says, I'm tasking you to help lead this army. So I want you to go and get 10,000 men, and we're going to go and we're going to face the army. And Sisera in particular, he's the commander of Jabin's army. He is going to be the one that we're going to slaughter. Okay? Now, this is interesting because Barak is told as someone who acted in faith. And yet, the tone that we get in verse 8 and 9, listen to this. Barak said to her, after she says, this is what I want you to do. Barak said to her, if you will go with me, I will go. But if you will not go with me, I will not go. And she said, of course I'll go. But because of this path that you're taking, because you want me to lead, Sisera is not even going to be your kill, basically. Okay, it's going to come at the hand of a woman. And if you guys know the story, you know what's coming. But it's interesting because Barak, who's not even a judge, is summoned by Deborah, and she says, I want you to be the person that goes and gets the army, and we're going to go together. And Barak, in faith, does what she says, but he says, I want you to go. I want you to lead. I want to follow you. If you don't go, I'm not going. Because because he's observing something that's really uncommon, especially in this day and age. Deborah, as a prophetess, was probably a minority. In this day and age, in this culture, to be a woman who is judging Israel was probably uncommon. And even today, we have some of that tension of how people see things, whether it's politically or whatever. We're not getting into that. But this was just an uncommon thing. And yet, Barak says, you are the leader, and so I want you to go with me. I want to follow you. Very uncommon. And yet, very, very powerful, because he recognizes that that's the role that Deborah was. She was judging Israel at that time in this area. Okay, so what happens? Barak is summoned by Deborah. They decide to go together, 11 through 16.
Now, Heber, the Kenite, had separated from the Kenites the descendants of Hobab, the father-in-law of Moses, and had pitched his tent as far away as the oak in Zananim.
It's great. Perfect.
Which is near Kadesh. When Sisera was told that Barak, the son of Abinoam, had gone to Mount Tabor, Sisera called out his chariots, 900 chariots of iron, and all the men who were with him from Harosheth Haggayim to the river Kishon. And Deborah said to Barak, up, for this is the day which the Lord has given Sisera into your hand. Does not the Lord go out before you? So Barak went down from Mount Tabor with 10,000 men following him. And the Lord routed Sisera and all his chariots and all his army before Barak by the edge of the sword. And Sisera got down from his chariot and fled away on foot. And Barak pursued the chariots and the army of Harosheth Haggayim. And the army of Sisera fell by the edge of the sword. Not a man was left.
Okay, awesome. So check this out. So Barak says, yeah, we'll go. He gets the 10,000 men. They go. They're ready. They're at Mount Tabor. Okay, and Sisera's coming from this way, and there's this battle that ensues. What's interesting, does anybody remember the detail about Sisera's army? What did they have? Chariots. How many chariots? 900 chariots, okay? Now, in this day and age, that was like the army, okay? You are fortified if you have chariots and horses instead of fighting on foot. And specifically, to have 900 chariots you were an unstoppable force. This was a mismatch. And so 10,000 men coming against 900 chariots as well as the rest of the army, this was unheard of. But Deborah says, God has given us this battle. Let's go. And what happens? They slaughter every single person except for Sisera, who pansies out, jumps off the chariot, and runs. Right? And so Barak continues wiping out all the chariots. There says in verse 16, there was not a man left, but Sisera is now running. Okay? So after they slaughter him, we see in verse 17 to the end of the chapter what happens.
But Sisera fled away on foot to the tent of Jael, the wife of Heber the Canaanite, for there was peace between Jabin and the king of Hazor and the king of Heber and Canaanite. And Jael came out to meet Sisera and said to him, Turn aside, my lord, turn aside to me, and do not be afraid. So he turned aside to her into the tent, and she covered him with a rug. And he said to her, Please give me a little water to drink, for I am thirsty. So she opened a skin of milk and gave him a drink and covered him. And he said to her, Stand at the opening of the tent, and if any man comes in and asks you, Is anyone here? Say no. But Jael, the wife of Heber, took a tent peg and took a hammer in her hand. Then she went softly to him and drove the peg into his temple until it went down into the ground while he was lying fast asleep from weariness. So he died. And behold, as Barak was pursuing Sisera, Jael went out to meet him and said to him, Come, and I will show you the man whom you are seeking. So he went into her tent, and there lay Sisera dead, when the tent peg had assembled. So on that day, God subdued Jabin the king of Canaan before the people of Israel. And the hand of the people of Israel pressed harder and harder against Jabin the king of Canaan until they destroyed Jabin the king of Canaan.
Oh my god.
You guys catch this?
Yeah.
I mean, this is like the epitome of middle school boys summer camp story before bed, right? The judges are where the action is. But think about this. Sisera, who is now running in fear, goes and hides. He goes to who he thinks is an ally, right? The wife of somebody who he was supposed to be on good terms with. The wife gives him a place to rest. She gives him something to drink. And then as he's sleeping, and it doesn't tell us why. I think my guess would be that she knows what the Israeli army is doing. She recognizes God at work, and she wants to be on the winning team. It could be other things. I mean, maybe she's just like, woohoo, right? But I don't know. Whatever it is, God uses her to fulfill what he said he was going to do. Because God is a faithful God. God is true to his word. And through the message that he gives to Deborah, as she's talking to Barak, she says, you're going to lead the army of 10,000, but guess what? You don't get the kill of the captive because I'm going to be the leader and you're going to follow me. And God is going to give him over to the hand of a woman. It's a crazy story. But I want you guys to see what the next verses, chapter 5, verses 1 through 2. Just read that for us, whoever had that.
Sang Deborah and Barak, the son of Abinoam, on that day, that the leaders took the lead in Israel, that the people offered themselves willingly, bless the Lord.
Yeah. The leaders took the lead in Israel. This is interesting to me because I feel like this might not be true for everybody that we've talked about, but I think that a consensus about what we've been looking about in the area of faith is that a person who is faith-filled is a good leader, right? Rahab took the opportunity in her hands to be the person in charge, on point, to lie and to protect the spies. The prophets, as they sent messages, they were leading the charge on giving messages to God's people. All of the guys, Gideon, who we looked at, was the leader of the army. And even in his questioning, his testing of God, he was the leader. But it's interesting because Barak is called a man of faith, passing through Hebrews 11. And what we see with the person of Barak is that he was kind of just a player in the overall story, but he wasn't the leader. Deborah, who was judging Israel, was the one who was in charge. And Barak acted in faith to follow the leader, play his part, and God was faithful to what he said he was going to do. I think so often when we start talking about faith, especially faith as it correlates to like action in our lives, kind of gets trampled by, if you want to be a person filled with faith, you got to be like the extrovert at the front of the line, right? Look at Barak. Look at the person of Barak who followed a person, did what he was supposed to do, and he was a man who is called a man of great faith. My question for us to think about tonight as we're finishing up is this. How do you respond in faith, even, and I think a more apt word would be especially, when we're following somebody else's leadership? How can you be faithful? How can you be a faith-filled person when you get to be a part of the team and not the person blazing the trail? Because I think if we're honest, if we actually think about this, probably this is more commonly applicable to our lives. There are so many aspects of life where we're working in team, where we're following with somebody else, working together. And I mean, just think about school projects, think about in the home, think about at your work, for those of you who work. Even for our staff, we work together in team. How can you be a faith-filled person when sometimes it feels like, somebody else has got that? It's easy for me to take the back seat and ride the coattails, whatever it is. Barak is a great person to challenge us that we ought to be faith-filled people in all aspects of life. And especially when we get to play a supporting role, when we get to come alongside someone, and maybe somebody else is taking the lead on something, and how can you look and say, God, what are you wanting of me in this situation? And how can I be faith-filled so that you can be faithful like you want to show me you are? That's a super cool question. I think that if we can frame this aspect of faith, not only to the big moments in life, but every moment of life, this is a good question to ask ourselves. What does that look like for you this week? How can you be faith-filled like Barak was? Maybe you're not Deborah, but how can you be Barak in your situation this week? It's a good question to think about. Let's pray.